What if everything you think you know about spiritual awakening is backwards? What if the experiences most people call awakening, the bliss, the unity consciousness, the feeling of transcendence, are actually just the beginning of something far more difficult and far less comfortable than anyone wants to admit? Carl Jung spent his entire career studying people undergoing spiritual awakening, and he discovered something that contradicts almost everything the spiritual community teaches. Real awakening isn't primarily about enlightenment experiences or elevated states. It's about descending into the darkest parts of yourself you've been avoiding your entire life. It's about confronting what you've kept unconscious. It's about integrating the shadow you've spent decades projecting onto others. Jung called it individuation, and it's nothing like what Instagram spirituality promises. There's no permanent bliss, no escape from difficulty, no transcendence that bypasses the mess of being human. Real awakening, according to Jung, makes life harder before it makes it easier. And most people who think they're awakening are actually just having temporary experiences that will fade, leaving them exactly where they started. I'm about to reveal the surprising truth about spiritual awakening according to Jung, and why understanding what awakening actually requires might save you years of spiritual bypassing disguised as development. Here's what Jung understood that the spiritual marketplace doesn't want you to know. Most of what's marketed as spiritual awakening is actually psychological inflation. It's the ego appropriating spiritual experiences as proof of specialness. It's consciousness having temporary peak experiences and mistaking them for permanent transformation. It's people feeling briefly elevated and assuming they've transcended their psychological issues rather than just temporarily escape them. Real awakening, Jung discovered, looks almost nothing like what most spiritual teachers describe. It's not primarily about light, love, and unity consciousness. It's about darkness, difficulty, and differentiation. It's not about transcending your humanity. It's about fully embodying it by integrating everything you've rejected about yourself. The spiritual marketplace sells awakening as an escape from your pain, your shadow, your humanness, your problems. Awaken and you'll be free from suffering. Awaken and you'll live in permanent peace. Awaken and you'll transcend all your psychological issues. It's marketed as the ultimate solution to the difficulty of being human, but Jung would say, that's not awakening, that's spiritual bypass. Real awakening doesn't let you escape anything. It forces you to confront everything. It doesn't solve your psychological issues. It makes you face them directly instead of projecting them outward. It doesn't transcend your shadow. It requires you to integrate your shadow into consciousness. This is why so many people who claim to be awakening are actually just spiritually bypassing. They're using meditation, practices, and peak experiences to avoid doing the real psychological work that actual awakening requires. They feel temporarily elevated and mistake elevation for transformation. They have unity experiences and think they've permanently transcended ego. But 6 months later, they're back to the same unconscious patterns, just with spiritual language to justify them now. Jung emphasized, spiritual experiences are common. Spiritual transformation is rare. You can have profound experiences without any real development. The experience of awakening and the reality of awakening are completely different things. What follows is the surprising truth about what spiritual awakening actually requires, according to Jung, and it's nothing like what you've been told. The first surprising truth about spiritual awakening is that it requires descending into the darkest parts of yourself, not transcending them. Real awakening doesn't elevate you above your shadow. It forces you to go down into your shadow and integrate what you find there. And most people who think they're awakening are actually just avoiding their shadow while claiming they've transcended it. Here's what Jung discovered. Everyone has a shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, repressed, and exiled from consciousness because they don't match your self-image. Everything you believe you're not, everything you judge in others, everything you can't admit about yourself, all of it gets pushed into the unconscious shadow. At ordinary consciousness, you manage your shadow through projection. You see your rejected qualities in others and judge them harshly for having the traits you can't acknowledge in yourself. You maintain the illusion that you're good, moral, evolved by making others carry your shadow. It's unconscious. You don't know you're doing it, but you're constantly projecting your inner darkness outward so you can keep believing you're light. But real awakening, Jung said, requires withdrawing these projections. It requires looking at who you judge, what you criticize, what triggers your strongest reactions, and recognizing that's your shadow being reflected back. The qualities you hate most in others are the qualities you've most deeply repressed in yourself. And awakening requires owning them, admitting them, integrating them back into consciousness. Think about the spiritual people you know who claim to be awakened but are actually full of shadow they won't acknowledge. They preach love, but passive-aggressively punish anyone who disagrees with them. They talk about unity, but judge everyone not on their spiritual level. They claim egolessness, but constantly need validation that their awakening is real and important. That's shadow operating unconsciously, while consciousness claims enlightenment. Real awakening requires the humility to admit, I'm not beyond these qualities. I have rage, I have selfishness, I have cruelty, I have manipulation, I have everything I've been judging in others, and I've been blind to it in myself. That admission is where awakening actually begins. Not in transcendence, but in descent. Not in rising above, but in going down into what you've been avoiding. Jung called this shadow work, and he said it's the foundation of individuation. You can't truly awaken without integrating your shadow. The awakened person doesn't claim to be beyond darkness. They admit they contain darkness, and they've integrated it consciously, so it's no longer running them unconsciously. But shadow work is only the beginning. What comes next is even more devastating. Most people build a new ego identity around being awakened or spiritual, and Jung discovered that identity has to be completely demolished before real awakening can happen. You can't individuate while identified with being the person who's individuating. The ego creates identity to feel secure. At ordinary consciousness, you identify with being successful, attractive, intelligent, moral, whatever qualities make you feel valuable. But when spiritual awakening begins, ego does something clever. It creates a spiritual identity. Now you're the awakened one, the conscious person, the enlightened teacher. You've just traded one ego identity for another. This one happens to be spiritual. Jung called this spiritual inflation, the ego appropriating spiritual development as proof of specialness. You're not just a person anymore. You're an awakened person. You're not just growing. You're enlightened. You're not just learning. You're spiritually superior to those still unconscious. The ego has co-opted awakening to reinforce its sense of importance. But real awakening, Jung discovered, requires this spiritual identity to die. You can't truly individuate while clinging to identification with being awakened, because that identification is still ego, just ego wearing spiritual clothing. Real awakening means the death of all identity, including spiritual identity. It means you stop being able to say, I am awakened, because there's no I identifying with awakening anymore. This is devastating for most spiritual seekers. They've spent years building a spiritual identity. They're known as the conscious one in their friend group. Their whole sense of self is wrapped up in being more awakened than others. And then real awakening comes and destroys that identity completely. Suddenly, you can't claim spiritual superiority. You can't identify with being enlightened. You can't even hold on to being the person who's awakening. All identity dissolves. Jung emphasized, the death of spiritual identity is more painful than the death of ordinary identity. Because with ordinary identity, you could escape into spiritual identity. But when spiritual identity dies, there's nowhere left to escape to. You're face to face with the groundlessness of having no identity at all. The truly awakened person, according to Jung, can't tell you they're awakened, not because they're being humble, but because there's no one left to identify with awakening. Identity has dissolved. There's just consciousness operating without an identity claiming to be conscious. But even this doesn't capture what Jung considered the most misunderstood aspect of awakening. Jung's third truth completely contradicts what the spiritual marketplace sells. Real awakening integrates darkness, not just light. The fully individuated person isn't purely light, love, and peace. They're whole, which means they consciously contain both light and dark, both creation and destruction, both love and appropriate ruthlessness. Here's the insight. Wholeness includes darkness. The self, the totality of who you are, contains everything, not just the acceptable parts. It contains your capacity for love and your capacity for cruelty, your ability to create and your ability to destroy, your compassion and your appropriate ruthlessness. Real awakening means becoming conscious of all of it and integrating all of it, not just the parts that make you feel good about yourself. But the spiritual marketplace sells only light. Be loving, be compassionate, be peaceful, transcend anger, aggression, selfishness. Become pure light. Anyone still expressing darkness is unconscious, unawakened, spiritually inferior. This creates what Jung called one-sided development, consciousness that only integrates positive qualities while continuing to repress negative qualities into shadow. The result is spiritually bypassing people who are all light on the surface and all shadow underneath. They preach love, but have no healthy aggression to set boundaries. They talk about peace, but have repressed anger that leaks out as passive aggression. They claim egolessness, but manipulate others through spiritual language. The darkness they won't integrate consciously is expressing unconsciously, and they can't see it because they're identified with being only light. Jung discovered you need your darkness, not to act it out unconsciously, but to integrate it consciously. You need your healthy aggression to protect yourself and others. You need your capacity for destruction to destroy what needs destroying. You need your selfishness to honor your own needs instead of compulsively people-pleasing. These aren't qualities to transcend. They're qualities to integrate consciously, so they serve development instead of sabotaging it. Think about spiritual teachers who claim to be pure love but have no healthy boundaries. They get exploited and their work collapses. Think about awakened people who've transcended anger but have no capacity to say no. They're people pleasers who betray themselves constantly. Think about those who claim egolessness but can't stand up for themselves. They're spiritually bypassing their need for healthy selfhood. Real awakening, Jung said, creates people who are whole, consciously integrating both light and dark. They're loving, and they're capable of appropriate ruthlessness. They're compassionate, and they're capable of necessary destruction. They're peaceful, and they're capable of righteous anger. They don't identify with only the light because they've integrated the darkness consciously. The awakened person doesn't claim to be beyond darkness. They admit they contain it, and they've learned to express it consciously in service of life, rather than letting it express unconsciously in service of destruction. That's the difference between integrated darkness and repressed shadow. But there's something even more uncomfortable Jung discovered about the awakening process. If these truths are surprising you, that awakening requires descending into shadow, that it destroys spiritual identity, that it integrates darkness, not just light, you're beginning to understand what Jung meant by real psychological awakening versus spiritual fantasy. Before we explore the final two surprising truths that completely contradict mainstream spiritual teaching, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these final two truths reveal why most people who think they're awakening are actually just beginning a journey that's far more difficult than they imagined. What Jung observed about awakening contradicts every promise the spiritual marketplace makes. Real awakening strips away all your coping mechanisms, all your defenses, all your unconscious strategies for avoiding reality. And for a long time, you're left with nothing to replace them. You're more raw, more vulnerable, more exposed to difficulty than you were before awakening began. Awakening dismantles your entire previous operating system without immediately providing a new one. You can't go back to unconsciousness, that's no longer available, but you haven't yet established new conscious ways of functioning. So, you're in between, you've lost your old ways but haven't gained new ways. And that in-between period is harder than the unconsciousness you left behind. Before awakening, you had defenses. You could repress difficult emotions. You could project your issues onto others. You could escape into distractions when reality became uncomfortable. You could maintain comfortable illusions about yourself and life. These mechanisms weren't conscious, but they worked. They protected you from experiencing the full intensity of reality. But awakening strips these mechanisms away. Now you feel everything directly. You can't repress anymore because you're aware of what you're feeling. You can't project because you recognize when you're doing it. You can't escape into distraction because you're conscious of your avoidance. You can't maintain illusions because you see through them. You're fully exposed to reality with no psychological protection. And reality is difficult. Relationships are hard. Work is hard. Your own psyche is hard. You're feeling everything you used to numb. You're confronting everything you used to avoid. You're experiencing everything you used to escape. And for a long time, months, years, it's just harder, more painful, more intense, more overwhelming than when you were operating unconsciously with all your defenses intact. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, and he emphasized it's not a brief, difficult period. It's a prolonged state of increased suffering that comes from having your defenses stripped away before consciousness has developed new, healthy ways of working with reality. Think about how awakening has made aspects of your life harder, not easier. How you can no longer tolerate relationships that unconscious you could maintain. How you can no longer do work that unconscious you found bearable. How you can no longer ignore difficulties that unconscious you could escape from. Awakening hasn't made these things easier. It's made you unable to tolerate what you used to tolerate. Those defenses weren't protecting you from reality. They were keeping you unconscious. That armor wasn't helping you. It was preventing development. Those coping mechanisms weren't making life easier. They were keeping you stuck at an unconscious level. Awakening has to strip them away before consciousness can develop healthier ways of engaging reality. But there's a long period where you've lost the unconscious ways, and haven't yet developed the conscious ways. And during that period, life is objectively harder than it was before awakening began. The truly awakened person doesn't promise that awakening makes everything easier. They tell you honestly, awakening will temporarily make your life much harder. You'll lose relationships. You'll outgrow work. You'll be unable to tolerate what you used to tolerate. And that increased difficulty is proof your awakening is real, not proof you're doing it wrong. But there's one final truth that might be the most devastating of all. Jung's final truth shatters the fantasy most people have about spiritual awakening. There's no final enlightenment where awakening is finished and you're permanently transformed. Real awakening is continuous psychological work that lasts your entire life. New layers of shadow to integrate, new identities to release, new unconsciousness to make conscious. It never ends. Consciousness development has no endpoint. You never arrive at final enlightenment. You never reach a state where all shadow is integrated, all unconsciousness is conscious, all development is complete. Because as you develop, new layers become visible that weren't visible before. Consciousness is infinite. You're always discovering deeper layers that require integration. The spiritual marketplace sells awakening as an endpoint. Get enlightened and you're done. Reach awakening and you've completed the journey. Become conscious and you've arrived at the final destination. But Jung would say, that's ego fantasy. Ego wants an endpoint because it can't tolerate the groundlessness of continuous development with no final achievement. Real awakening, what Jung called individuation, is a lifelong process. You're always integrating new shadow, always releasing new identities, always making new layers of unconsciousness conscious. The work never stops because consciousness never stops developing. There's no final state of being awakened. There's only the continuous process of awakening more deeply. Think about teachers who claim to be fully enlightened, completely awakened, totally conscious. Then watch them. They're still acting from shadow, still identified with being enlightened, still unconsciously hurting others while claiming transcendence. They stopped developing the moment they decided they'd arrived. But the truly awakening person never claims arrival. They're always discovering new unconsciousness they didn't know was there, always finding new shadow to integrate, always releasing new identities they didn't realize they were clinging to. They're not getting more enlightened, they're getting more aware of how much unconsciousness remains. Jung emphasized, the moment you think you've completed awakening, you've stopped awakening. Real individuation includes awareness that development is infinite. You're never done. There's always deeper layers, always more shadow, always more unconsciousness. The work continues until death, and maybe beyond. This is devastating for people who got into spirituality hoping for an endpoint. They wanted to reach enlightenment and be done. They wanted to become awakened and stop struggling. But Jung tells them, that endpoint doesn't exist. You'll be doing this work until you die. And if you stop because you think you've arrived, you've just stopped developing while unconsciousness continues operating beneath your claim of completion. The awakened person, according to Jung, lives with the humility of knowing they're always partially unconscious, always have more shadow, always have more work to do. They don't claim enlightenment. They admit they're continuously awakening and that awakening will never be complete. Let me bring these 5 surprising truths together. Real spiritual awakening requires descending into your shadow, not transcending it. Facing the darkness you've been projecting rather than claiming you're beyond it. It destroys your spiritual identity before creating real self. The ego that identifies with being awakened must die completely. It integrates darkness, not just light. Wholeness includes consciously containing both creation and destruction. It makes life harder before it makes it easier. Your defenses get stripped away before new conscious capacities develop. And it's never complete. Individuation is continuous psychological work that lasts your entire life. This is nothing like what the spiritual marketplace promises. No permanent bliss, no final enlightenment, no escape from difficulty, no transcendence that bypasses your humanity. Real awakening, according to Jung, is descent into shadow, death of identity, integration of darkness, increased difficulty, and continuous work that never ends. Most people who think they're awakening are actually just having temporary peak experiences while avoiding the real psychological work that awakening requires. They're spiritually bypassing, using spiritual language and practices to avoid shadow work, ego death, darkness integration, and the hard reality that awakening makes life harder and never reaches completion. But if you're willing to do the real work, to descend into shadow, to let spiritual identity die, to integrate darkness, to tolerate increased difficulty, to accept that development never ends, then you're ready for what Jung called individuation. Not spiritual fantasy, but real psychological transformation. If you're genuinely awakening, Jung would tell you, stop believing spiritual fantasy and start doing psychological work. Stop claiming you've transcended shadow and start integrating it. Stop identifying with being awakened and let that identity die. Stop trying to be only light and integrate your darkness consciously. Stop expecting awakening to make everything easier and prepare for increased difficulty. Stop thinking you'll reach completion and commit to continuous development. Real awakening isn't what you've been sold. It's harder, darker, more destabilizing, and more continuous than spiritual marketing admits. But it's also real transformation versus spiritual inflation. It creates wholeness versus one-sided persona. It produces genuine psychological development versus temporary peak experiences. The surprising truth about spiritual awakening is this: it's not primarily spiritual at all. It's psychological. It's shadow work, ego death, darkness integration, and continuous development. That's what Jung discovered. That's what real awakening requires. Stop seeking spiritual experiences and start doing psychological work. That's the surprising truth. That's the real path. That's what Jung called individuation. If you're ready for real psychological awakening instead of spiritual fantasy, subscribe to this channel. Join thousands doing the actual work of individuation using Jung's wisdom. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.